Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the weekly Central Asia in Focus newsletter. Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoyev visited a military base in the southern part of his country on November 17th and examined the Bayraktar military drones purchased from Turkey. All 5 Central Asian countries have purchased military drones, and most are producing drones on their own territory. It promises to change the security situation in Central Asia dramatically. Who's selling drones to Central Asia, and who's helping the individual Central Asian countries produce domestic drones? And as important, what can we learn about the 5 governments' intentions for using these drones? To discuss all this, I am joined by Derek Bisaccio, Forecast International's lead analyst for international defense markets, specializing in the defense trade in Eurasia and the Middle East regions. Derek's focus is on major conventional weapons entering service with regional militaries, defense budgets they use to pay for those systems, and threats that drive the force posture. Francisco Olmos, senior researcher in Central Asia Affairs at Spain's GEOPOL 21 Center, and also a research fellow at the London-based Foreign Policy Center, and the author of the article Dawn of the Drone Age in Central Asia in the Diplomat magazine last November. Thank you all for joining me. Fran, let me start with you. Can you run us through which countries have which sorts of drones?
Sure. Well, first thing, thank you, Bruce, for having me. So the thing to highlight is all the 5 Central Asian republics. They all have drones in their arsenals since the past years. No, but there's the way they've achieved this and the type of drones they have varies significantly from country to country. If we start, for instance, with Kazakhstan, in the Kazakh case, we've seen they've recently, the process of producing with license some Turkish drones, some Anka drones. There was a test flight early this year, so they're looking to purchase those drones. While they also have some Chinese drones, wing long, and these drones are, for combat purposes, not on surveillance. And they also have other smaller drones like a Russian Orlan 10, which are used for surveillance purposes, 2 types of Israeli drones, and some small US-produced drones hand launch for surveillance purposes. Besides this, they're also developing their own homemade drone, the Shagala, that already had a test flight a few years back. When it comes to Uzbekistan, for instance, well, like you mentioned at the intro, we've found out, let's put it like this, recently that they have also acquired some Turkish-made Bayraktar drones, the TB2s. Besides that, they also had some Chinese drones, the same as Kazakhstan had. While in the meantime, they also have other small drones, again, American made Raven drones, which are for surveillance, and some also Russian Zala 4-1 drones. Then we go to, for instance, Turkmenistan. It's probably it stands out as the one that has the most heterogeneous mix of drones. From in terms of surveillance, it has different types of Israeli drones, Italian, Belarusian, some US, again some Russian. And when it comes to unmanned combat aerial vehicles, UCAVs, again Turkish drones, the Bayraktar TB2, some other Chinese drones, and then loiter munitions or suicide drones. They also have some Israeli drones in this case, maybe also some Belarusian. We still don't know. If we move on to Kyrgyzstan, well, Kyrgyzstan, they've recently started building their arsenal in the past few years, and they're going, let's say, full on Turkish-made devices. So they have the aforementioned Bayraktar drones, Akinci, Aksungur, and also apparently they also acquired some Anka drones. So the full catalog, let's say, of attack drones made in Turkey. Kyrgyzstan also have some other minor drones like Russian or land drones for surveillance. Tajikistan is a very different story. They've looked towards Iran, so they have some Ababil-2 Iranian drones. Again, some U.S. surveillance, small surveillance drones, Puma drones, and and some Russian ones also, small devices. So as we see, it's a very heterogeneous mix of drones. Of course, there's some usual suspects there, Russia, Turkey, and so on. But I guess we can discuss it further.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Derek, let me bring you in here for a second. But first, I'm going to ask you one question about the U.S. drones, because I want to make this clear to our audience. Can you talk about what kind of drones the U.S. supplies to Central Asian countries? Because I want to deal with this and then move on to the more formidable military drones.
Yes, absolutely. So what the United States supplies, and Fran hit it right on the head. So there's the RQ-11 Raven, there's the Puma, and then I believe Turkmenistan has actually also acquired the Scan Eagle, which is a related UAV. All of these are unarmed. They're all for reconnaissance. They're all for patrol. For getting out to oil and gas infrastructure. In the case of Turkmenistan, or in the case of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, it's to monitor the border, to make sure that there isn't infiltration coming on from, say, Afghanistan or the like. But there's certainly these ones, at least from the United States, are not armed. A lot of the other drones that we were talking about and that have come into Central Asia in the last few years are, but the American ones are not.
Okay, then let me follow up here and ask you the big question: is when you look at who's acquiring drones and who's producing them, can we say there's like a leader in drone technology in Central Asia among the 5 countries?
So it's definitely seemed like Turkey has become the leader, which is an interesting point, in the sense that the countries in Central Asia have really been purchasing from virtually any supplier that has a big drone on the market. The Central Asian countries are certainly interested in them. So they've purchased from easily a half dozen or more suppliers. These are large suppliers. These are large countries like Russia or China, the United States. But it's also small suppliers, or medium-sized suppliers, I should say, like Turkey, or Iran, or Israel. I think certainly Turkey has emerged as the leader, if you will. 4 of the 5 countries in Central Asia operate at least one of their platforms. The TB2 is now in three countries, with Uzbekistan showing off 4 of them the other day. The Anka is going into service in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan next year. Kazakhstan is going to produce it. Kyrgyzstan, I believe, is just off the shelf. And they also purchased the Akinci as well. So that has really shown that Turkey is emerging as a big leader. There was talk that they would also sell to Tajikistan, but it seems that Kyrgyzstan kind of put a damper on that one after they purchased their own drones from them.
Okay, let me throw in one more question real quick to you, Derek, before I go back over to Fran. How many countries does Turkey work with to help them produce their own domestic drones? Do you have any idea?
I don't have the number offhand, but a number of them, and that's one thing that has really helped the Turkish model out, is that they're not just looking to sell off the shelf. I'll give you a comparison. China's drones, for the most part, it seems like a lot of them have just been sold, quote unquote, off the shelf, where you come to them, you walk into the store, you say, I'd like a drone, and they sell it to you. Versus Turkey will do that as well, but they'll also go in and sign license production agreements so that the country itself can localize the supply line. They can hire their own citizens to work in those plants. And they might even be able to achieve export sales as well. In Central Asia, at least, all 4 of the countries that have bought Turkish drones, with the exception of maybe Turkmenistan, are looking at drone production locally. I know Kyrgyzstan, I don't believe it's been explicitly said that they will produce Turkish drones, although they've looked at their own drone project. I believe it's called the Sarah 2, that was shown off a couple of years ago, that they could certainly look into production agreements with Turkey, either for that drone in particular or its subsystems. So Turkey has sold its products to dozens of countries over the world. I don't know how many in total also have licensed production agreements, but a lot of them.
Okay, thank you, Fran. When I look at the reports coming out about who's the drones and stuff, you get the impression that the leadership of all these countries considers this a big prestige thing, right? I mean, they really make a big deal out of showing that they have these different kind of drones. Can you talk a little bit about how that's portrayed to their own public, or to the international viewers too? That like Turkmenistan, for example, regularly features these drones in parades. The security chief in Kyrgyzstan posts on Facebook all the time about drones. Can you talk a little bit about, I don't know, the psychological culture of drones in Central Asia and what it seems to mean to the leadership there?
Yeah, I mean, I will cover Turkmenistan a bit later. Let's leave it till the end of the question. So, yeah, we see there, on the one hand, So, for instance, if we go on a case-by-case basis for Kyrgyzstan, I think there's two angles to it. There's the prestige component of, we're now purchasing, the latest weapons, or, quite advanced weapons that we didn't have before. And we saw, for instance, President Japarov, in this ceremony, signing on the drones, putting his signature on them, showing that they're reinforcing the armed forces, and they're purchasing this latest equipment, or quite advanced equipment. So that is one thing, calling to the domestic audience. And we know President Japarov, probably also his populist kind of segment, and a nationalist vibe that he has. On the other side, there's also a PR component, or deterrent component, when we're talking about Kyrgyzstan, given the conflicts that it had in the past with Tajikistan, saying, "Hey guys, we have now this weaponry." And actually, in the latest border conflict, we saw the Turkish drones reportedly in action. For Uzbekistan, same principles of displaying the latest weapons, although probably with less fanfare than Kyrgyzstan. And Kazakhstan also, the modernization of their armed forces, showing videos of the test flights of the Ankam and so on. For Turkmenistan, I think it's like most things related to Turkmenistan, we have to look at the leadership and the leadership style. So, I mean, I have no proof of this, but given the former president's antics, playing commando and allegedly or reportedly flying a trainer jet, and so on, and the vast array of different types of drones, it does feel like collecting toys, quote unquote. So I think there's different aspects to it. Of course, like you mentioned, the prestige. Then each regime tries to play to their own public. There's also probably that deterrence component. When it comes to Tajikistan, is a bit harder, because we have not seen that display. I mean, of the 5 countries, I'm not a military expert, but I think is the one that's lagging behind. They have some Iranian drones, but they seem to have less capabilities, the experts say, compared to, say, some of the Turkish drones, for instance. So they do not have that way of displaying. But again, when they build the factory of Iranian drones, it was on TV, and they show the facilities and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a prestige element, sometimes for the domestic audience, sometimes also for the international audience, depending on the country's own situation and geopolitical situation.
Okay, thanks, Derek. When you look at the drone market, the international drone market, Central Asia, of course, it's where it's located. It probably has a lot more pull in the Chinese direction than a lot of other countries. But what if you're an international seller of drones? You're selling your drones anywhere. Is there any special appeal about the Central Asian market?
So I think, for one thing, number one, it's they're willing to talk to any supplier, even though they're geographically they're very close to China, as you pointed out, and it's just as far as historical legacy, and in some of them even military alliances are very close to Russia. But even so, across the board, you see all of these countries not just purchasing drones from suppliers around the world, but you see them purchasing all sorts of systems. So like with Turkmenistan, what we see is that they're willing to go and purchase all sorts of military equipment from a country like Turkey. They're willing to purchase from Israel. They're willing to purchase from the United Arab Emirates. They're willing to purchase from Italy. What that makes appealing for the Central Asia region is that, number one, you have an export market to go to. So if you're looking to sell drones, you know that you have countries in that region that are interested, that don't have a whole lot of drones, and that there might not be a whole lot of attention to for you, as much competition as you might expect. Uzbekistan, for example, is one of the larger militaries in the region. They really only started acquiring combat drones as of about the last week, actually. They were rumored to have purchased the Wing Long a number of years ago, was never really seen, and it certainly wasn't seen in any military exercises or any drills. But now it appears to be in service. But at the same time, they also showed off Turkish drones. They showed off some Russian reconnaissance drones, and they showed off one of their own. So there's a lot of avenues where defense suppliers around the world can cooperate with these guys, and I think that makes them very appealing.
Okay, thank you. You know, because the second part of the show is going to be the meat of the show. So I'm going to remind everybody right now that we're talking about the age of military drones in Central Asia. And my guests are Francisco Olmos, senior researcher in Central Asia Affairs at Spain's GEOPOL 21 Center, and also a research fellow at the London-based Foreign Policy Center, and the author of the article Dawn of the Drone Age in Central Asia in the Diplomat magazine in November 2022. Derek Bisaccio, Forecast International's lead analyst for international defense markets, specializing in the defense trade in Eurasia and Middle East regions. Derek's research centers on major conventional weapons entering service with regional militaries, defense budgets they use to pay for those systems, and threats that drive force posture. Thanks again for being on the show. Now let's try to figure out what exactly the Central Asians are going to think they're going to do with these weapons, right? Fran, I guess I'll start with you. You're purchasing this stuff. You make a big deal out of it to your public that you got them. What do they expect to do with them? Let's start with the Tajik Kyrgyz case, because this is the most obvious case. But after that, it gets a little bit more vague as to what their intentions are with these drones.
Yeah, I mean, from like you said, the Kyrgyz-Tajik case, it became very evident since the first border conflict, 2021, if I'm not mistaken, that both armed forces were. I mean, there was always in the region the least buoyant, the least developed of the armed forces in Central Asia, and they looked away forward. Kyrgyzstan looked at drones, I think, as a cost-efficient way, right? Because to have fighter jets and so on, or advanced helicopters, it has a cost that they cannot afford. But drones they can. I mean, is a cheaper way, and they put them into action in the latest episode of the violence with Tajikistan. They allegedly destroyed a couple of tanks, some rocket launchers, and a truck or something like this. So they've again reportedly been already used. But so beside Tajikistan, okay, we can see it that is playing catch up in this sense. We already mentioned it's probably the least strong in terms of drones in the area, but with the potential conflict with Kyrgyzstan is always in their mind, I presume. Then we have the Afghan angle. So as Derek mentioned, especially the U.S. Surveillance drones. I mean, it's no coincidence that Tajikistan has them, Uzbekistan has them, and also Turkmenistan has one of them. And they all border Afghanistan. Especially telling for Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, because they were given these drones or with grants and so on in the last couple of years. So pretty much when the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan. So in terms of surveillance, I think that's a clear view for those countries bordering Afghanistan. But besides that, I mean, I think it's just another component of their armed forces of these countries. I mean, nowadays in the 21st century, you don't only have like the Air Force with jets, or if you have them, or ground forces with tanks and so on and so forth. But you also have another branch, which is drones, right? So it's any country, I mean, in the world that's modernizing their armed forces, they're also purchasing drones, and I think in this Central Asia is no exception. Of course, with the difference that we just mentioned. I mean, most likely and hopefully none of them will see action, which means everything is smooth and peaceful in the region. So let's hope for that. But they have to modernize their armed forces, and looking at drones, I think, is a also cost-effective way. Especially for some of the countries, namely Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, that can spend less in their army, that don't have really an air force. So it's a way that they can diversify and kind of substitute the lack of an air force. And apart from a handful of Soviet era or Russian-made helicopters, with weapons that they can manage, they can afford to some extent, and that gives their firepower and that deterrence.
Okay, thanks, Derek. When I see the Central Asian countries buying all these drones, we presume that this is supposed to be used against militants that maybe entered the country somehow or another. How effective are drones if you're dealing with small groups of people roaming around the country?
So let me put it this way. It's certainly more effective, and this kind of gets to what Fran was saying, more cost effective to be using a drone to be going after them than to have manned aircraft that you're sending out there, either scouting all the time or trying to run strikes with them, especially if you look at the manned aircraft that are available in the Central Asia region, they also might not be quite as effective. They might not be quite as accurate if you have to actually carry out a strike. So that's where the drones are particularly appealing, because Central Asia, and particularly being such a mountainous area and in many cases very remote. A lot of communities or a lot of border areas are not all that easy to access. Roads getting there might actually just be one. There might not be a heliport out there or an airport out there, and you might not have rail that can bring you out there, and certainly driving vehicles around. So what that enables with the drones is that you can track things not only a lot more cost effectively and easily, but they can also hang out there for a while. So a lot of those Turkish drones, for example, that we're talking about, they have endurances up to somewhere from 24 hours to 30 hours, a lot of them, something like that. So they can hang out there. So if you get kind of an idea that, along a border area in a spot that you want to patrol, you can leave that drone up there for a little bit and then, replace it as necessary, send another one out or what have you. But that gives you the flexibility to not only just monitor it, but then for the TB2 and a lot of these armed drones, it then also allows you to, if you do identify a target, you see something that's getting a little too close to your border, then you carry out a strike. There could be, a scenario where there's a bunch of militants that are hanging out on the other side of the border. They're not directly coming across, so you don't know really what you want to do with them. But you post a drone, you have it watch, and then the moment they cross, into the border, then you can do something about them.
Okay, I'm also curious, how hard is it? How difficult is it to train local personnel to operate these?
It's certainly not a walk in the park, but it's easier than training them to operate, say, a manned aircraft, like a fighter jet, for example. The amount of time that you're going to be putting into them to operate it is going to be a lot simpler. Oftentimes the controls are a lot easier. In some cases, it might even be a video game controller, which if you're, talking to young folks or folks that are just enlisting, they probably grew up playing video games or having exposure to that stuff. So it might even be a little intuitive. One challenge, though, could be when you're purchasing them from Russia, from China, from Iran, from Turkey. Big question comes: what instruction manuals come with it, and how effective are the countries themselves that are selling them at training you? Because usually that comes hand in hand with any agreement. You'll purchase the system, and you'll also have maintainers that'll come over and they'll train both your operators as well as the folks that are going to be performing maintenance on it. So that's a big question. And then, as I was saying, then also the language of the manuals. If you're trying to, if you speak Russian and you're trying to work on a system and the only manual you can get is in Chinese, it's going to be very difficult because you need somebody who can translate it or read it.
Okay, thanks. Fran, before we get too far away from the simple reconnaissance drones, I'm kind of curious. Now, we've been talking about what they're good for in terms of military and security, for an external threat, shall we say. But there's also a concern about what certainly the reconnaissance drones, what they can do for domestic politics too, and watching over your own population. There was an incident in Turkmenistan in March 2018 where a surveillance drone fell into a neighborhood. Something happened to it and it fell into the neighborhood. The military had to come and retrieve it. You've been watching Central Asia a long time. Do you get the idea that certainly in terms of the reconnaissance drones, that a lot of this is for domestic surveillance?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, every weapon a state purchases, military purchases, can be turned against its own people or against an external enemy. So, and drones are no exception in this sense. Of course, knowing the authoritarian character of many of these regimes, it's no surprise that they would be used to surveil or spy on or look at their own population. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised that that's one of the reasons why they use them. I mean, again, I think probably the main reason still belongs to the external threat, especially Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the plus those countries bordering Afghanistan. I think that's still the number one use of it, of them. And I wouldn't think the U.S. would have given those drones to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, if they were used to look at their own population, right? So I think that's also worth bearing in mind. But of course, they can be used to look at their internal dissent or to look at their whether people or to prevent any movement against the regime. I mean, a few events in the last years come to mind where I have no I don't think drones were used, but why not? They could have been used Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan in January 2022. I mean, again, those are events where, as part of the state's repressive or controlling hardware and capacities, drones can be just one more of them, right? So I wouldn't say it's the main reason why these drones are purchased and how they can be used, but especially more the surveillance ones, not, I mean, the strike ones, things would have to get out of hand really for them to be used. But yeah, why not? It's one of the other uses that they could use them for lack of a better word. So yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't have a straight answer because getting into the mindset of these regimes, as you know, is always a bit tricky. But knowing how their authoritarian character and how they keep tabs on the population at all levels, right? For their social media, or preventing demonstrations, so controlling dissent, so on and so forth. Drones can be just another tool in the arsenal. Yeah.
Thanks, Derek. You study. You're following all kinds of countries. Do you have any examples of domestic surveillance drones being used for domestic surveillance in other countries, and what does that look like?
So not like a specific specific event or something where there was like an accident or a catastrophe, but certainly to kind of just piggyback with the direction that Fran's going, I would undoubtedly assume that they would use these, especially in the case of, say, Kazakhstan in January in 2022 when that issue emerged, or in Kyrgyzstan when they've had some uprisings as well. Whether they have used them, I don't know for sure, but they certainly, I can't fathom that they wouldn't, just haven't seen the amount of armored vehicles that they'll deploy and other military personnel just during those. I do know just offhand, just looking at, like, for example, like Kazakhstan, it's Shagala UAV. One of the purposes that they put to it is that it could be useful for monitoring oil and gas infrastructure, which therefore means they're going to be flying around in their own country. Right. So the point is, if you're monitoring that, you could also monitor disruptions to it. You could very easily just then be using this drone to then monitor protests or monitor, whatever it is that you're looking to use it for. So I would think that's quite likely that they would employ it in that way. That's also, there's a number of concerns for why the U.S. wouldn't want to export armed drones to this region. That's not the only one, but that is one of them, that the United States wouldn't want to be in a situation where it supplied a Reaper drone to a country that then turned around and fired it at their own people.
Okay, and let's look at how the regional ties and what the age of drones means to Central Asia. I mean, we've seen the Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan case, but in the past, before drones were in the area, there have been some tensions along the border. I mean, Uzbekistan used to not be such a good neighbor. A couple times their troops crossed into Kyrgyzstan. Actually, they've crossed into Kazakhstan in the 1990s too, trying to move the border. I mean, when you look at the five countries in Central Asia who seem to be getting along pretty well now, do you think, should we be concerned about the fact that they are now arming themselves with these kind of drones? I'll start with you, Fran.
I mean, I don't think it should be a cause of concern per se. I mean, like I said, it's just another element of modernizing and keeping up with the times, purchasing drones. So I don't think it should be a cause for concern, like I mentioned, in this sense. I mean, if they want to have if there's a border conflict, it's not going to be because one of the countries has drones or the other doesn't, or both have, right? I don't think it's going to be a factor that is going to influence the creation of a conflict. There's many other reasons that can sit behind regional tensions and border disputes. I don't think drones are one. So, for this sense, I mean, it's if they purchase or they renovate their attack helicopter fleet, or purchase either that jet or anti-aircraft missiles, so like they've been doing, especially Kyrgyzstan in the last couple of years. I mean, drones are just a component of that. I don't think they're going to be a cause for concern. It's just them keeping up with the times and arming themselves with the latest quote unquote technology compared to what they had previously, right? So yeah, I mean, I don't think that a country has drones or doesn't have drones is going to be a factor that's going to influence as to conflict starting. I think the reasons are lay in other matters with this border or the political tensions between countries that hopefully, as you mentioned, now they're most of them in the past few years they've been in good terms compared to previous years. So yeah, I mean, I would dispel that as a drones as something that's going to cause trouble per se, but they will be a tool in case there's trouble, like any other weapons that they have at their disposal.
Okay, thanks. I was thinking that after the last Kyrgyz-Tajik border clashes in September 2022, the Tajik border guards, for instance, were very concerned about reconnaissance drones. They were constantly reporting what they said were violations by Kyrgyzstan flying their drones over Tajik territory or right along the Tajik border, and it seemed to heighten tensions a little bit in the region. Derek, since we're kind of down the rabbit hole here with this, is this the start of a drone race in the region? I mean, again, the countries say they all get along together, but now they're all purchasing drones. Is this a kind of a drone arms race that's starting here?
I think especially in the case of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, that's a real problem to be watching for. By contrast, for the other three, it was around like the mid 2010s that Kazakhstan started showing off its first armed drones, and that didn't really seem to get much of a reaction from the other four. Even if you look at the size of the Uzbek military and the Turkmen military, they're pretty comparably sized to Kazakhstan. But that didn't really seem to raise a whole lot of alarm bells that they were worried that Kazakhstan importing these were going to cause a bunch of issues for them. Turkmenistan, of course, did go ahead and acquire a lot of drones, and it's purchased a lot. But Uzbekistan, meanwhile, sat basically on its hands for the entirety of the 2010s and has only now been starting to bring any in. So that kind of speaks to me that even though those three countries have been overhauling their militaries a little bit, they've been looking to bring new things into the system and replace a lot of the legacy Soviet equipment that's still kind of hanging around. Even despite that, despite the fact that they're modernizing their militaries, those three haven't really been in a competitive arms race. By contrast, their two smaller neighbors, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, are really where we're starting to see some elements of that taking off. As Fran said, these weapons aren't really exactly changing the nature of warfare here. So it's not like they're creating entirely new capabilities that these countries didn't have, or that they're really destabilizing things. But they offer a lot for these militaries in terms of precision. They allow them to be a lot more accurate than maybe they have been in the past. If you look at the way that these clashes with Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan were usually taking place. Bruce, I mean, you've written about this before, where it was something to the effect of like throwing stones in fistfights, and then out of nowhere, all of a sudden, next thing you know, it's bombs, it's artillery shells, and it's drone strikes. So it really shows that where the confrontations occur, importing these drones are really going to start widening the area of destruction, and potentially expanding the conflict area. One real issue that Central Asia faces, so even though in the modern era there isn't as much direct conflict between the countries, or there isn't, as we're talking in Uzbekistan going into everybody in the 1990s, but there isn't a whole lot of multilateral cooperation between these countries either. The United States has tried to do the C5 format that would bring them all in. Obviously, three of them are part of Russia's CSTO, and every so often they do actually hold multilateral summits, just their heads of state for the five countries. But there's not a whole lot that's formalized. So it does mean that even though things are fairly cordial now, it could take, a couple changes of governments, a couple bad incidents, and all of a sudden, we're right back into, sort of the dark days for the region.
If I can add to that, Bruce, and Derek just mentioned briefly some time ago, and when we're talking about that arm race, and he mentioned Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and the episode when, after the 2021 clash, that's when we saw Kyrgyzstan step up and start buying Turkish drones. So before that, they didn't have, but because they, I think Tajikistan got the upper hand in that conflict, in that clash. Then we saw them start buying Turkish drones, the Bayraktar TB2. And then, early last year, when I think it was the the Tajik defense minister went into a trip to Turkey, the rumors surfacing that they were also going to buy the same type of drones. And even, who's now I think still is the foreign minister of Kyrgyzstan in parliament, he admitted that, yes, Tajikistan is going to buy these drones. So there was a bit of a panic in Bishkek from the Kyrgyz authorities. Now that the advantage that they had gained was going to be, matched, from overnight. In the end, that didn't happen. And we just mentioned briefly before, but at the end, that didn't happen. And then Tajikistan looked to Iran to source its drones. But it does show that that race or that rivalry between these two countries, and there was a moment in time where Kyrgyzstan thought that this advantage they had gained after purchasing with much fanfare and propaganda, if you will, their Bayraktar drones, and overnight Tajikistan was going to match it, right? The end didn't happen, but it just gives us an indication of quote unquote competition between those two countries in the drone sphere.
Okay, thanks. We're coming to the end of the show, but I want to give you both a chance to have your last word. And if there's something I missed, then please, this is the opportunity. But the question that I would ask now is, what do we're past the point of no return with this. All the countries got them. There's no way they're going to give them up. What do you see as the major significance of the fact that it is the age of the drones in Central Asia? And I'll start with you, Fran.
Well, on the one hand, we see the armed forces of these countries, looking towards the present and modernizing themselves. There's also we briefly also mentioned the production of domestic drones. So there's Uzbekistan with the Lochin or Falcon drone, which also President Mirziyoyev looked at, and there've been some videos about that. So those are trying to develop their domestic capabilities, but these drones are more modest in terms of capabilities. My question is, as we at the very beginning of this episode, we mentioned, why they're purchasing these drones, because the nature of some of these regimes, the authoritarian nature and the leadership style, one does wonder if the purchasing of lots of drones in the case of Turkmenistan, or like 4 types of Turkish drones in the case of Kyrgyzstan, what if there's also a military angle to enhance military capabilities, or if it's just the whims of the actual leader, right? So this is also something to bear in mind when we look at the future and what the drones are going to bring. But overall, enhanced capabilities, as any other weapon would do, adjusting to the budgets, and I think it's just Central Asia keeping up with the times within their own means. I don't think there's anything like negative per se. It's just buying other types of military equipment. But it's a development that is also worth keeping an eye, because it does indicate which countries follow which. Let's say in terms of international relations, right? You see Kyrgyzstan in this case very aligned to Turkey, which reflects in the drones. You see Turkmenistan neutrality policy with 5, 6, 7, 8 suppliers of drones. You see Uzbekistan now and Kazakhstan leaning towards Turkey to some extent. Tajikistan with its love and hate affair with Iran now, so it does also is good to look at this topic, because it also gives us, with a bit of course of measure, and we have to be careful about it, but it also gives an indication where these countries situate themselves in geopolitics as a whole. I think that's one of the also key takeaways that I would take from this.
Okay, thank you. Derek, we can give you the last word. What do you see as the major significance of the age of drones in Central Asia?
So I'm looking at it from a couple angles. One thing that's always particularly interesting for me is where they're purchasing these things from, and what the market looks like. So the big thing, and I mentioned this earlier in the interview, but the big thing that kind of stands out to me is you have both the presence of large suppliers and you have medium sized suppliers from the outside. That for me, it's very interesting to see these different countries that often are competing with themselves. Then trying to compete for attention in Central Asia. So in particular, Turkey and Iran, that Turkey has really interacted with the Turkic Central Asian countries. And Iran has meanwhile started to set up production facilities in Tajikistan. So the question then becomes for that, okay, what's the next step? So if Iran's producing drones in Tajikistan, do they then go ahead and produce armored vehicles, missiles, and rockets? Maybe that's down the line. That's one of the main things that's really jumping out to me. But then also just on a force structure side of things or a force posture side of things, stepping away from Central Asia just barely to go over to Georgia. Georgia, several years ago, one of the issues they were looking at is they have a fleet of Su-25 ground attack aircraft. And what they realize is that the only country they're realistically going to fight is Russia. And in a conflict, just like in 2008, that they're quite likely to lose those Su-25s and the experienced pilots that you paid for to fly them within an hour or two of fighting Russia. So Georgia was looking at, what can we do with drones? And, and they wanted to replace their Su-25s. What they came to the conclusion, this is 5, 6, 7 years ago, was there wasn't anything on the market. Well, now there are things on the market. So they're starting to buy loitering munition drones and maybe looking at getting rid of their Su-25s again. So then coming back to Central Asia, where I'm starting to look and where I like to see takeaways is what does this mean as far as those countries' inventories? Because like Georgia, they have a lot of systems that came from either from the Soviet Union or it was very soon thereafter that are making up their inventories. That a lot of that stuff it's only going to last so long. And it's going to need to be replaced. And it's fascinating for me to watch where they replace it in a sense that's not one-to-one. So you're not replacing an Su-25 with either a new Su-25 or a new manned ground attack aircraft. You're really replacing it with a bunch of drones that can effectively do the same thing, even if it looks a little different. It's kind of a long-winded way to say I've got 2 takeaways, but those are my 2.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you both. Thanks, Derek and Francisco, for being on the program. We'll certainly be watching the skies over Central Asia in the future. And a big thanks, as always, to Nathan Shoemaker, our Mejlis podcast producer in Washington, D.C. And a reminder, you can subscribe to the Mejlis podcast or the Central Asia in Focus newsletter by visiting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website at rfprl.org. Thank you very much, and we'll be back next week. Bye-bye.